Okay, today we're going to talk about the Romanian deadlift and the single leg Romanian deadlift and all sorts of variations on hinging, bilateral, unilateral hinging, and everything in between. Format of this video is going to go first. I'll just go ahead and demonstrate the movement. Then I'll talk about the why of the movement. I'll talk about warm up and preparation for the movement and how to incorporate it into your workouts and into your sessions. We'll go into more detail about it, and then from there, we'll go ahead and talk about various regressions and other related movements that will fit into using hinging and Romanian deadlifts and single leg Romanian deadlifts. So for the single leg Romanian deadlift, which is the movement we're going to focus on the most, and then we'll talk about all the movements around it. You're going to want a kettlebell, some kind of heavy object. Generally, it's held in the side in this sort of suitcase manner, but there are variations of it where you can do a goat style hinge where you hold it against your chest as well. You could even turn it into a good morning by putting it over in between your shoulder blades as well, and there are reasons and benefits why you might want to do that. But for the most part, people will usually do it this way. There's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is just that having the weight down low is going to help with your balance. So in this movement, there's lots of ways to set it up. You can either set it up ipsilaterally, so that means that your posting leg, your supporting leg, is going to have the weight on the same side, or you can do it contralaterally, which your posting leg and the weight, the arm holding the weight, are going to be different sides. So I'll go ahead and demonstrate both of these and talk about why you might want to do one or the other. I'll begin with the contralateral movement. So I like the contralateral movement quite a lot. For some people, it's going to feel more or less natural. And honestly, at the beginning, sometimes I'll just let people pick whatever feels most natural to them. There are certain times where you might want to assign one or the other, but for the most part, if one feels more natural to people, and if you find them getting confused, figuring out which leg, which arm, just let them do what comes natural. As long as they get a balance of opposite arms and opposite weighted sides, it'll be fine. So one of the reasons why I like the contralateral one is because it helps me to keep my hips closed, which I'll talk about right here. So I want to come down. I don't care about if the kettlebell touches the ground. My shoulder blades are retracted, my chest is up. I try to make my body as long as possible, and then I come back up. Because I let this cross over my side, sometimes this is called a cross Romanian deadlift, because the act of crossing it over keeps my hips in better position. But I'll show you again, coming down here and coming back up. Okay, from the side, it's going to look like this. Set my body, coming down, trying to make my body nice and long. That's contralateral. Ipsilateral, same arm, same leg. This one, what I like about this one is it allows me to really stretch out with my offhand. So making my body nice and long, coming down, really trying to keep everything straight, trying to keep my back straight, and then back up. And then from the side, it's going to look like this. Set my body, shoulder blades back. Ooh, a little wobble. All right, that's a demo. You don't have to do it at that speed. I was just concentrating. I didn't want to rush through it. So those are the two main variations of the single leg kettlebell Romanian deadlift. Now we'll talk about the movement in more detail. All right, first thing I'm going to talk about is sometimes what's called an empty Romanian deadlift. I often just call it an empty hinge. People will call it bodyweight Romanian deadlift. I don't say bodyweight because that confuses people. People might think that you are using your own, the equivalent of your own body weight. So if I weigh 80 kilos, sometimes people say bodyweight Romanian deadlift. They might assume that you're doing a Romanian deadlift with 80 kilos. So I generally call it an empty hinge. Whenever I talk about an unweighted movement, I'll just call it empty. So empty windmills, empty hinges, etc. An empty hinge, standing Romanian deadlift, whatever you want to call it. So from standing position with my feet about hip width apart, standing nice and tall, shoulder blades back, I'm just going to push my bum back. This is really just the simplest form of the hinge. I'm feeling some tension in my hamstrings. I want to keep my spine neutral. My core is nice and tight. My shoulder blades are back. I'm just going to do a few of these just like that. I will do these almost every single warm-up with the class, and there's a lot of reasons for it. One of them is it's just a very quick way to assess if people have hinges. You know, do they understand that they're pushing their hips back and they're not rounding at their lumbar spine? Do they have scapular control here? Are they bending their knees too much? Or do they understand the hinge is happening through the hips? Can they feel the tension in the hamstrings? Can you correct them? It's just a very, very simple movement that most people can do right away. And if you have some members who are having trouble with it, it's good because right away you know what you're going to have to work on. So almost 100% of the time I'm going to run this. Nice way to stretch the hamstrings, but most importantly, it's just a good precursor, and it's going to prime people to ensure that their hinge patterns are looking good. They're getting control over their lower back, their upper back, and scapula. It's just really nice, okay? Now, if I know I'm going to have single leg Romanian deadlifts in either the peer coaching or in the conditioning, probably peer coaching because it's not a movement that really scales up well under speed, then I'm going to do some variation of hug the world. Now, I call it hug the world because that's how I was taught. A lot of people call it an arabesque as well, which is probably the correct term. So you can just call it an arabesque. Anyway, hug the world. The reason I call it hug the world, you put your arms out like this and you're coming down like you're trying to hug the earth. It's good for balance. Come back up again. So you have your arms out like that. That's going to increase your balance. What I really like about it is it gets people to focus. So it forces people to concentrate. It's not a movement that you can just rush through really quickly. It has that sort of self-limiting element where if you rush through it, you're not going to do it correctly. Once you get used to that, I've been running a lot of arabesque with arms overhead. So I establish overhead position, elbows straight, getting your humerus behind your ear line, abs tight so you're not hyperextending. Once you get there, then I've been doing the arabesques like this. And the reason that I've been doing them like this is because they have very good carryover to handstands and to cartwheels. Because when you start your cartwheel, it's a very similar movement, except you open up your hips a little bit like that. It also helps with kick-ups into handstands, keeping tension, knowing how to use your hamstrings, etc. So I'll do a few arabesques, and then while I'm working on the arabesques, there's other things that I can focus on. I know what the major faults are going to be on the single leg Romanian deadlift. One of the big ones is going to be that your shoulder blades become protracted because sometimes people try to touch the kettlebell to the ground, which we don't want. So sometimes when I'm doing the arabesques, I'll have the hands down like this and I'll just have them do some scapular retraction work, almost like you're doing scap push-ups. Except I just get them to start thinking about, I want the shoulder blades retracted at the bottom. That's going to stop us from rounding the back and getting people away from the idea that they have to touch the kettlebell to the ground, which is almost going to certainly lead to bad form on the deadlifts. The other thing that I like, and you can do this with the cross contralateral deadlifts as well, is you can do a reach through while you're doing your arabesque. And that's going to act as sort of a tactile physical cue. It gives you something externally to think about. And what it's going to do, it's going to help you from getting your hips into abduction. And I'll show you what I mean. So a lot of times when people come down, they're going to kind of come sideways like this. And we want them to even out their hips. And sometimes if you tell people to close their hips, even if you have a good cue like the wine glass on the lower back, sometimes people won't get it. So what you can do is you can force them to get it by having them do a reach through. And this is similar to having people touch their elbow when they're doing their Spider-Mans or reach through on the Spider-Man. But if I have someone whose hips are opening up like this, I'll say, okay, what I want you to do is I want you to reach through like that. And then when they reach through, they're going to close their hips. So instead of having them open like this, it's going to have them close it. So that can be beneficial as well, especially if you don't have time to do hip airplanes. That's just a quick way to clear that up. So if I know I'm going to be running the single leg Romanian deadlifts, I'm definitely going to do a empty hinge. I'm definitely going to do some variation of hug the world or arabesque just to get people used to that. And then at that point, they're probably ready to start building up to some single leg Romanian deadlifts. I'll talk about progressions and regressions later in the video when you want to use a dowel, etc. But now it's time just to break down the movement. Okay, so with the single leg kettlebell Romanian deadlift, one of the things you want to impress on your members is you want it to be slow and smooth on the way down and slow and smooth on the way up. I'm going to just go ahead and use this dowel so I can talk about things without flopping all over the place, and I can hold positions a little bit better. So when I say slow and smooth, when you come down, you want it to be a slow, smooth movement on the way down, and you want it to be slow and smooth on the way up. What you want to avoid is you want to avoid people just falling into it and collapsing, and then from here you just don't want them to stand up like that. So it's smooth on the way down, smooth on the way up, and be really mindful of people getting into this position and then just standing out of it, because you're going to get as much, if not more, benefit on coming out of the movement as you do going in. So it's both sides. Don't just think about hitting that position and then losing position. You want to hit that position going into it and coming out of it. We need to talk about this idea of open and closed hips. So there's a lot that can happen when you're doing your single leg Romanian deadlifts, when you have your feet planted like this, and you can go into external rotation, you can go into internal rotation. I'm talking about the hips now, okay? And then you can also fall into abduction when your hips open. So it's happening, and there's lots of things we can focus on, but we want people to develop the control to keep their hips more or less neutral, so everything's pointing forward, but then also to make sure that we keep our hips closed so we don't fall into abduction. So we want to have active adduction down here, and there's lots of ways we can do it. I already talked about the reach through cue, and then I'll talk a little bit more in depth about the cross body deadlift. But one of the other things that we can do is we can just try some verbal cues on this. So one of the things I'll tell people is I want you to imagine you have a wine glass on your back. This is a very common one. If you open up like this, the wine glass is going to fall off. So you can just get people to think about this wine glass cue to keep their hips nice and even. Sometimes what you can do is you can get people to think about the opposite. You know, whenever you're trying to correct things, you can always have people try to exaggerate the movement and then control the exaggeration. So when I'm doing hip airplanes, one of the things I want people to do is open up their hips like this. So I'll give them the opposite cue. I'll say, imagine there's a mouse on your back and you want to slide off. You slid the mouse off your back. Okay, congratulations. Now someone gives you a glass of wine and you want to keep the wine stable. So this is really just going in and out of a hip airplane variation where we're opening and closing our hips, but showing people they have control there is nice. And just doing some high rep hip airplanes is really nice because you will feel it in all the muscles around your hips. So make sure people understand the open and closed hips, so when they're doing the peer coaching, they can be coached and coach each other. Then other things to think about with this movement, we want the body to be long and taut. So sometimes I'll talk about, imagine you have a piece of string and you're holding it loose and it has this big sort of bend in it, and then somebody pulls on it on either end and it's taut, and now you can twang it like a guitar string. That's sort of what we want your body to be like, and that we don't want everything to be floppy. You want to be nice and tight. You want to have that tensegrity going on. So when we do it, sometimes I'll have people put their hand forward and I'll say, imagine you're looking into a mirror, and I want you to try to reach, and I want you to touch that mirror as much as you can. You want people to think about being horizontal and being long. I'll do a similar cue where I'll say, okay, when you're doing this, I want you to reach forward and have your other leg go back, but I want you to imagine somebody's pulling on your wrist and someone is pulling on your ankle to make you nice and long like this. We really want to focus on people getting horizontal and long and not having people focus on getting low. And I've talked about it a little bit, but I'll talk about it again. The number one thing we want to avoid is we don't want people to think that this is the goal of the single leg Romanian deadlift, is to get the kettlebell to touch the ground. It's not. I much prefer that people take a second, they get their hips in alignment, they retract their shoulder blades, and the kettlebell's never quite touching the ground, and they come in and out of it smoothly like this. This is a much more beneficial movement than having some people come down here, collapse into it, and then pick it back up again. So there probably are times when it's beneficial to have the kettlebell touch the ground and pick it up. If you wanted someone to train in like the golfer's lift or something like that, I could see benefit to that. But the way that we coach it, we generally do not want the kettlebell touch the ground. We want it to be nice and controlled and smooth. As I mentioned, you can do it ipsilaterally or contralaterally, and if you don't have a why, if you don't have a specific reason for why you're teaching one or the other, I find that you can just save time by letting people do what's most natural for them. So that would be whether or not they want to have the weight in the same leg, the supporting leg, or if they want to do it contralaterally like this. Okay, there's benefits to each one. Like I said, I should probably be switching legs. I've been doing so much on my right leg, I should probably do something on my left leg. But what I will say is if you have it contralaterally, then you have that cue. Hang on. I'm confusing myself with the stick here. Okay. So if you're doing it contralaterally like this, okay, and if you think about bringing the kettlebell over, it can help close the hips. So if you think about crossing the center line in that cross Romanian deadlift, that can be helpful. But honestly, you can just have people do whatever feels most natural for them. Most of the time, as long as it's consistent, as long as they hit each leg, and as long as they even out which arm is supporting the weight, most of the time that's not going to make a big difference unless you have a specific reason. So the crossbody, like I said, is going to help with your hip adduction. And then you really want to emphasize that we do not care about touching the ground. You really want to focus on a tight core, retract shoulder blades. We do not care about that kettlebell hitting the ground. Points of performance on this are going to be your supporting knee is going to be soft. You want your shoulders back, shoulder blades retracted, stiff core, neutral spine, and then when your body comes down, your swing leg comes down, you want them to be parallel to the ground as long as possible. I mean, physically, you want to lengthen yourself out. So if I do it, I'll do it ipsilaterally. So if I come down like this, I want to be nice and smooth, my shoulder blades retracted, trying to make my body as long as possible, trying to close my hips, and then I come back up like that. Generally, people are going to be much stronger in this than they think they are. The limiting factor at first is often not going to be weight, it's going to be balance. And in fact, some people will find that if they add heavier weight, then they might actually feel more stable because that heavy weight is going to be below their center of mass, so it's actually going to help them balance out a little bit. Those are the main points about that. In a second, I'll go ahead and talk about regressions and other related movements. Okay, so I want to talk about regressions and related movements. One of the things I do a lot, especially in programming in earlier communities, when communities are first starting up, I'll do a lot of hip airplanes. And hip airplane is very much related to single leg Romanian deadlift with a slightly different emphasis. With these, I like to have 2 dowels on these. You don't need 2 dowels. You can also use a chair or a tree. And when you're doing them, if you put them out like this, that'll give you a wider base of support. So if you angle them out like this, it's going to help you be a little bit more confident. And the hip airplanes, this is a good peer coaching thing because people can work on developing their cues and also their body awareness. We're going to have them come out here, and then I'm going to close my hips and I'm going to open my hips. And what I'm doing here is my back knee. I'm thinking about getting my back knee to point at the sky and then to point at the ground. Point at the sky and point at the ground. Okay? So we're working on opening and closing our hips. In this case, there's a lot going on. There's all kinds of rotation going on. There's also some abduction, abduction, and adduction, a lot of that as well. And you just do a few of these, and before long you are going to start to feel a nice burn around both your hips. So get those on each side. That's just a nice way to prep some cues and also get some body awareness. Biggest helper on all the single leg Romanian deadlift is just going to be some nice sturdy dowels. Because the dowel work is really going to help. You can have people practice the movements with dowels. You can also practice different arm combinations. And that's just going to take balance out of it. There's nothing wrong with having people do a dowel and a kettlebell when they're first learning, because they're still going to get the benefits of the strength work. It is going to take out some of the balance benefits. So it is nice to get both of them in, but if you find that balance is a huge limiting factor and people are getting discouraged, there's nothing wrong with using a dowel. And then the single leg Romanian deadlift has all kinds of related movements as well. So once you get people used to doing the single leg Romanian deadlift, you can work in all kinds of things. One of the ones that I do quite a lot are the hinge walks. Normally I'll do them with 2 kettlebells, but I'll just do them with 1 because that's what I have on me today. So this is just going to be walking and walking and walking, and that doesn't look like much, but if you have people do sets of 20 of those with double heavy weight, they will really, really feel that. And that's a really nice beneficial movement. It also teaches some dynamic hinging. It's really good for building body awareness. It's one of those things at first people are going to collapse at the lumbar spine, but once they get used to that, that's really going to build them some strong patterns. Generally, anything that's done in the B stance or kickstand or staggered variation. So if you get into your B stance or your kickstand, whatever, and there's obviously different ways you can vary that. You can watch our videos on that. But just working on this is actually going to have a lot of the same benefits. And this is a very good regression if people just don't quite have the balance for the single leg Romanian deadlifts. Remember, the posting leg, in this case the front leg, is going to be the one that's going to take most of the work, and you're really going to feel that in probably the glutes and the hamstrings and maybe your spinal erectors on whatever your leading leg is. So leading leg should be taking most of the weight. So the single leg Romanian deadlifts will have all kinds of carryovers for the hinge walks and the B stance variations. Also, it's going to be very useful for handstand kickups and for cartwheels. We did a bunch of cartwheels yesterday in our mellow class and our exploration class, and you really saw that once people were getting used to it, that actually getting into the cartwheel, okay, which is something that looks like that, is just going to be something that is 100% related to your arabesques and to your single leg Romanian deadlifts. So as you build the mobility and the balance and confidence in that, then you realize that it's going to add to all kinds of gymnastics and body weight movements that we do down the road. So single leg Romanian deadlift is a great movement, has all kinds of carryover, and is just really going to help people build up a strong foundation so they can do all kinds of other movements.